Hi, this is Vantage Point, and we are recording at the sidelines of the Asia Pacific Roundtable 2013 happening at Hilton, Kuala Lumpur. And one of the topics that has been prominently discussed this year is the US-China relations, in specific more on the rise of China and also US's pivot to Asia. And what does it mean for us in this region, ASEAN region, and specifically in Malaysia as well? So for today, I have a very special guest on set with me to talk about it from the US perspective. I'd like to welcome and thank you Ambassador Christopher Hill, who is formerly a US Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, who is also currently a Dean of the Joseph Kerbal School of International Studies at the University of Denver. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Firstly, I would like to just put things into perspective. To begin with, we have two biggest economies, China and US, who also have the two biggest militaries in the world. And we look at this and we see that China wants a peaceful rise in Asia. But at the same time, they are also increasing their military spending year on year. Yeah. US is calling for greater transparency. But at the same time, we have increasing military expansion from the United States. Most recently is the deployment of the littoral combat ships surrounding the waters of Singapore. So maybe you could just start with perhaps clarifying about what is the US's role in this region, specifically ASEAN.
Well, first of all, I think the U.S. is very interested in a long-term productive relationship with ASEAN. I think we've always had that relationship, and I think if anything is more important to us, ASEAN is growing. ASEAN has done very well. ASEAN has really, I think, contributed greatly to peace and security in the region. I think ASEAN did a very good job with Burma, with Myanmar. So there's many reasons for the United States to be engaged with ASEAN and with ASEAN countries. So you will see a mixture of bilateral and multilateral engagement on the part of the U.S. toward the ASEAN countries. Now, with regard to China, I would really draw your attention to Secretary Hagel's comment recently in Singapore about the fact that the United States sincerely desires a good relationship with China. You know, for all the talk about the competition, there's also a huge element of cooperation. And we see this especially in the economic area, where these two large economies, as you pointed out, the United States and China, are very much linked to each other. Right. So in a real important sense, it's a relationship that's, how to put it, too big to fail.
Okay. Picking from your point about economic relationship, we see that China is expanding at a rapid rate. OECD has predicted China will be the biggest economy in 3 years' time. So there will be shift of economic power balance on a global scale, on the global stage. So what does the U.S. make out of this in terms of cooperation and also working together?
Well, first of all, the United States welcomes China's economic success. The more China grows economically, I think the better China will be as a partner and, in your case, as a neighbor. I think when you look at economic growth in ASEAN countries, it's been related to the fact that the Chinese economy has grown. So the real issues there is how is it growing? What are the issues that come up, for example, intellectual property rights, these sorts of things. And these are issues that we have to pay attention to. But we certainly don't begrudge China's growth. The issue is what is this relationship going to look like in the future? Will there be a sense, as I believe there should be, that there's plenty of room in Southeast Asia, there's plenty of room in the world for the U.S. and China to operate well. And what we need to do, what China and the United States need to do, is to really improve the pattern of cooperation, the sort of the way by which we talk to each other, the way by which we try to resolve disputes. And what we know, for example, is that President Obama is meeting with President Xi Jinping in California in an informal setting. And I think we can look for more of this kind of activity.
Going back to this pertinent problem within region, which is the South China Sea issue. Yeah. Well, you mentioned earlier about economic growth. We talk about China's economic growth. And a lot of these new threats that are coming our way may not necessarily be traditional threats. We talk about resources, we talk about energy security, water security. For example, China has the monopoly of rare earth, 97% monopoly of rare earth in the world, and this rare earth is so important to produce smartphones, military equipments. And Well, I'm not saying that we may go to war with iPhones in the next decade, but what I'm trying to point across here is that there will be rivalry in terms of economic resources. How do you view that kind of non-traditional security issues?
Well, there will be rivalry in some respects, although I would note to you the fact that if China is going to make all those smartphones, they have to sell them to somebody, and the U.S. market tends to be one of the biggest markets. But I think more generally, when you talk about the South China Sea, I think China needs to manage relationships with its neighbors maybe a little differently. And I think China needs to reflect on the fact that China is very big compared to countries like Malaysia, and then China needs to respect the concerns that other countries might have toward China. So it's not so much that China has really changed its policies. I suspect the Chinese policies or what their assertions are about the South China Sea are pretty much the way they've been for a long time. But what China needs to do is understand that there may be a different attitude from some of the countries in Southeast Asia, different attitude from countries like the Philippines and Vietnam. And so it's up to China to develop a relationship with those countries that it doesn't appear to be threatening to those countries.
Is it threatening to the United States?
I think the United States can handle its own issues, and I think the United States lives up to its treaty requirements, treaty relationships with many other countries. I think we can handle ourselves. I think the issue that we look for is a longer-term, calmer relationship, and I don't see any reason why China should get into difficulties with its ASEAN neighbors. I think China understands that it needs those good relationships, and certainly we don't need to be giving China advice on how to handle its relationship with Vietnam. They've had that relationship for over 1,000 years, and probably they'll have it for at least another 1,000 years.
Back to your point about China, the need for China to create a more comfortable environment for multilateral negotiations. China will be a global force, a global economic power soon, very soon. Do you think they have the capability in terms of international credentials, soft power, trying to play a bigger role in shared responsibility with the United States and other blocs?
Well, China is already an international, a world power in economic terms. But your question of what kind of soft power will China bring to bear on the issue, and there, you know, it's not for me to give advice to China.
What's your opinion?
But
What's your take
I think
on that?
China has some work to do there. In terms of its relationships and in terms of its reputation worldwide. China needs to look at some of these economic issues as an economist would in a sort of sustainable way. That is it sustainable to be having huge trade surpluses with certain countries? Are huge trade surpluses sustainable, or is sooner or later there going to be some backlash from those countries that are experiencing these huge trade deficits with China? So I think China needs to look at these things from a sustainable point of view. And I think most fundamentally, China needs to understand that they have a real interest in how the global economy works. They are a major factor in that global economy. That global economy has been very good to China. So I think China needs to be careful to make sure that the environment for its peaceful rise continues. And I think to do that, they have to be respectful and understanding of their trading partners.
Okay, Ambassador, I'll go to that point shortly, but first we have to go for the first commercial break. We'll be back later. Stay with us. Hi, you're back on Vantage Point. I'm speaking with Ambassador Christopher Hill. He was the former U.S. Assistant State Secretary to East Asia, and we're talking about U.S.-China relations. So, Ambassador, I understand that respect and understanding is very important in terms of foreign policy, but if we can put ourselves in China's perspective, let's say we talk about its domestic problems, it's a developing country, issues like cost of living, job opportunities, environment pollution are some of the issues that they have to tackle within the country of 1.3 billion population itself. From an outsider, from the US perspective and looking at China, a developing country, who is about going to be, in your words, has become a superpower.
Yeah.
What are your views on that?
I think every country has their domestic problems, and certainly China has more domestic problems than many people know. And I think part of China's problem today, really, in the late Hu Jintao era and also in the early Xi Jinping era, is that China has found it has to spend more time on these domestic issues than many of us understand. So I think China has had to worry about whether their farmers are getting adequate prices for their crops. China's had to worry about the whole issue of environment. I remember after the earthquake in China in 2008, when they found that some of the state sector buildings were built to a lower specification than some of the private sector buildings. This caused an enormous problem, especially with people whose children were killed in schools during this earthquake. So these are not small problems for China. And then very fundamentally, China has to look at their whole system of governance, and whether that system of governance, set up in 1949 after all, is really appropriate for an economy that has nothing to do with 1949. I mean, the Chinese economy is very modern in very many respects. So, you know, if you look at the problems that China has domestically, from the U.S. perspective, and by the way, we have our problems too, right. I wouldn't want to trade our problems for those of the Chinese.
Okay, taking your point of governance, and China recently witnessed a leadership change, the fifth generation leaders. The president and his committee members, most of them were not quite part of the Cultural Revolution. They were probably quite young then, and a lot of them have studied abroad. They hold masters and doctorate degrees in social science, economics, and they have experience of dealing diplomacy and issues, international issues. How do you see the change between the older generation of leadership in China and this one?
I don't think there's any question that a leadership in China today, where I don't think there's anyone who was born before 1949, is an important shift for China. And I think these people have very different perspectives on how far China has come. Those born before 1949, I mean, previous generations of Chinese leaders were very aware of how far they'd come. They're very aware of what the Cultural Revolution meant in terms of sort of the interruption of China's development, very aware of that. So now you have a new generation, and they're very aware of another set of problems, namely corruption, things like that. But you're quite right, many of them are well educated, and they're educated in a way where they've seen a perspective of China from outside of China. And so any problems one talks about in China are not unfamiliar to these people. I mean, if you talk about, as I just did, about the appropriateness of China's political system to its economy, and whether that's a good match or whether there need to be reforms in the political system, I think every Chinese leader is well aware of that issue. The issue is how really then to shift, how to make internal changes without creating internal convulsions. And so I think China has its work cut out for it in terms of making sure that it can kind of lay a new basis for future growth. And I think they're very much aware of that, which is why I really do believe that China, at the end of the day, really wants to work with the rest of us and wants to have a peaceful environment for it in which it can make these changes.
What are your thoughts on the new leaders?
Well, I've had the honor of meeting Xi Jinping, and I see a leader who's very much in the kind of problem-solving mode, a leader who has a sense of where to take the country. I thought his comments about North Korea were very refreshing. They were far more forward-reaching, or at least reaching in the right direction than previous Chinese leaders. So I think he understands what China needs to do, and it cannot be imprisoned by its past, that is, its past of dealing with a country like North Korea. It needs to be inspired by its future, that is, being a member of the global trading system.
I had the opportunity to listen to your talk earlier at the APR, and you mentioned that China plays a key role in the North Korea talks, and you yourself, you were chief envoy to the six-party talks, and looking at how things have developed over the past 2 decades with the nuclear ambition of North Korea, and how do you think US and China can work shoulder to shoulder to tackle this very pertinent threat to the global
I think the first
citizen?
issue in diplomacy is common interest. And I think
Right.
China and the U.S. have a common interest. It's in no one's interest that North Korea proceed with this nuclear ambition. So I think that common interest can take us some distance. But I think after that, what has to happen is we need to agree on a strategy on how to get North Korea to relinquish these weapons. I think China has made they always say we do not support North Korea's nuclear ambitions. Well, that's not enough. I mean, that's a nice thing to say. We don't support that football team, or we do support that football team. That's not enough to change the picture. I think they have to get on the field and start playing the game a little tougher. And so I would hope that when President Obama and Xi Jinping sit down, they can really talk specifically about how we can cooperate in a way that brings about a better result.
What concrete measures are you talking about from China's side that you want to see in this to resolve this?
I think when you hear American officials or even American former officials talking about China's need to impose sanctions on North Korea, it's probably good things don't happen in that kind of context. But I think China needs to kind of look at this foreign policy issue or look at this security issue with respect to North Korea the way a business person might look. That is, look at it as an effects-based policy. That is, what is the effect we are trying to produce? The effect we're trying to produce is a North Korea that gives up its nuclear weapons, that understands that keeping those weapons is a greater danger than giving up those nuclear weapons. That's the effect we need to produce. And so we need to have a policy that will achieve that effect. And just saying we don't want North Korea to have nuclear weapons doesn't achieve anything. So I think we need to see what China can actually do. And again, it's not for me to give advice to the Chinese on what specific economic measures or what specific political measures it can take. But I think China has within its toolbox, if you will, some capacities for dealing with North Korea that perhaps the rest of us don't really have at this point.
All right, Ambassador, I'll get to that point shortly, but first I'll let you go for the last commercial break. We'll be back in a while. Stay with us. Welcome back, and I'm still speaking with Ambassador Christopher Hill, who is the former U.S. Assistant State Secretary to East Asia, and we were just talking about U.S.-China relations. So, Ambassador, North Korea has been in talks for years, but has never agreed, tried, but never succeeded. So what do you think, what would it take?
Well, first of all, they have agreed. They agreed to abandon all their nuclear programs in September 2005. But your point's well taken. They've never actually implemented that agreement. So North Korea needs to be convinced that it's more costly for them not to abide by the agreement than it is to abide by the agreement. That is, they need to be convinced that the best outcome for them is to abide by the agreement. And there, I think the secret is, or certainly the secret formula here would involve the Chinese making it clear to the North Koreans that if you do not abide by this agreement that you made in front of us, in front of the Americans, in front of the other members of the six-party talks, this will be a fundamental and historical decision on your part with respect to your relations with us, the Chinese. I think the Chinese need to convince the North Koreans that they really mean business on this issue of fulfilling their obligations. And I do believe China has the leverage, but it's not up to me to find that leverage. It's up to the Chinese.
Right. Nuclear threat. Let's talk about a different form of threat, cyber war, espionage, and things like that. Nowadays, threats occurs in chat rooms, in Facebook or in China Weibo or in Twitter and Wikipedia and things like that. So you have years of diplomatic experience, 3 decades. You have worked in places in the Middle East, you have worked in Asia. So how are you training your next batch of diplomats to handle new threats like that, and what sort of diplomacy should we need?
Well, first of all, we haven't dealt with cyber threats for 3 years. There's no such thing. This is a new phenomena, and I think dealing with a new phenomena might require some new tools in the diplomatic toolbox. One of the problems with cyber attacks is they don't always have fingerprints. You don't always know that you've actually been a victim of a cyber attack as opposed to a victim of some crashed computers. So there are some problems there. But from what I can tell, there is evidence that China has engaged in this, and I think we need to have a serious discussion about that. I think there needs to be some effort to kind of lay out what are the rules of the game. There will be competition in our relationship with China. I'm not suggesting for a minute that there won't be competition, but there need to be some rules in that competition. You wouldn't have a football match without rules, and so I think there needs to be some rules to that, and I hope we can sit down with the Chinese on that, because both China and the U.S. and many other countries are very much dependent on computer systems, and I think to attack someone else's computer system is a very serious means to a serious ends, and so we need to work that out with them.
And what sort of new diplomacy, new dimension of diplomacy are we talking about to deal with this?
Well, I think we need to identify what the real problem is. We need to identify, what the capabilities of the parties are. I mean, there will be some competition in this area, but I think it's very clear that, if there is a perception that China is engaging in this or engaging in this for commercial benefit or something, that could be a big problem. And so I think we need an agreement of what the rules of the game are. And it's one thing to compete. It's another thing to compete by shutting the other person's computer systems down. So that's a very serious matter. And I think there are a lot of people, both international lawyers and technicians, looking at this question, what does it exactly mean? And there's some people who would regard this as an act of war. So whenever you engage in something like an act of war, you need to understand that is a very serious matter. So, I'm not pessimistic about this, despite the unknowns in the technology, which do make it difficult or more difficult. I'm not pessimistic about it, but I do feel we need to get to work on that, because it's something that, if you look at how the U.S. reacts to this, especially within the U.S., it's a very serious matter.
I would like to draw your experience, your diplomatic experience for so many years, and perhaps looking at your work 30 years ago and now. So what do you think is the way forward? And there are so many challenges, and we have, for example, just in ASEAN itself, you were talking about multilateral cooperation and things like that. So from your experience and moving forward, how do you have all these different players coming together in this region? And so more players, more complexity, but how do you actually solve things?
In 30 years, it's actually 33 years, but who's counting? Many things have changed, it's very true. Many technologies have emerged, many threats have emerged that weren't around a long time ago. But I think there are certain constants in the diplomatic field, and one of those constants is to have a respect for the other person's views and a respect for the other person's ambitions and what that other country wants to try to achieve. I think it's been very important as we deal with countries in Southeast Asia that one of the projects that has been underway in Southeast Asia now for decades has been ASEAN. It's been this concept of regional integration. It's been this concept of all these countries, at first 6 and now 10 and maybe more someday in the future, all want to somehow be together in the same house. Now, how much they want to be together, that's going to be up to them. But there is a concept within this part of the world that integration, that some kind of togetherness is important. So I think for the United States to be effective in Southeast Asia, we cannot say, well, we're only going to deal with you bilaterally. We don't want to pay any attention to the East Asia Summit, for example, or we don't want to pay any attention to the ASEAN Forum and things like that, is a kind of losing proposition. I think we need to be aware of what's important, and if that is commensurate with our interests, and I think it is, I think we need to work with ASEAN on these structures. And I like to think that's certainly what we've been doing, of late. And I think if we can continue to be respectful, and we are, and do as much listening as we do talking, in diplomacy, very important to be listening at least 50% of the time, maybe more. So I think if we continue to do that, we're going to do fine in this part of the world. And, the U.S. doesn't need to have pivots or rebalances or anything. We just need to stay here and remain engaged. And this is a part of the world that is really exciting in terms of its economic development. And I think you're going to see the U.S. Around here for a long time.
So if I may sum up the relationship between the U.S. and China at the moment, it would be cooperation, rivalry with a bit of a control, confrontation, That is healthy confrontation, would you say?
I mean, there's going to be competition. I don't want to call it confrontation, but competition between the U.S. and China. But I don't think we are asking any countries in ASEAN to choose between us and China. I think that's very, just not very helpful to what we're trying to do, very unproductive. So I think we need to recognize there's competition, but try to make sure that it's in the context of an overall positive relationship. Just as our defense secretary said the other day in Singapore, we want a good relationship with China. So yes, competition, but it should not be the dominant feature of our relationship. The dominant feature should be cooperation and an understanding that we are in these problems together. We have common agendas, common interests, and we ought to try to work that, and don't ask any country to choose between us.
Can I ask for a better summary? Thank you so much, Ambassador.
Thank you very much
for coming on the show, and thank you very much for watching Vantage Point. If you have any questions or feedback, you can find us on our Twitter or Facebook, or you also can email me at cynthia_ng@astro.com.my. That's all for this episode of Vantage Point. We'll catch you again. See you and goodbye.